the Mr. Reverend did it. Of course he did. He passed the big test that he needed to take. Pretty sure I mentioned a few times that he was prepping for one big exam for the next part of his career. And we didn't look it up until after the fact. But we did learn, sorry about my throat, we did learn that only 58% of people pass it the first time. So he gets to feel like an extra badass, basically. He did it. And it's like, I think pretty highly of the Mr. Reverend. I'm not like surprised that he passed, but I am very relieved that we just know that we don't have to think about that anymore, that we can move on to the other stuff that we need to now focus on in our life. And, I guess part 2 of my updates in my world is I have a job interview today. So it's good. It's all virtual. So I won't be wearing my robe and my I Heart My Cunt shirt to my to my Zoom interview later. So I'll have to clean it up. I'm taking it as a slow morning with the baby Reverend because he woke up right at our recording time. I was like, well, I got to be on pee and poop duty for a second, Tim. So I will be with you as quickly as I can.
Yeah, everybody will be able to test the Reverend's cognitive load this early today, everybody.
Oh, right? Like, oh my gosh, I need more coffee. Everything was obviously like with him studying for a test. That's almost time that I need to protect for him from the baby Reverend, especially because like nowadays he's just so aware and wants to spend time and like is like, yeah, daddy's studying, but I want daddy to play. Daddy doesn't want to study. Daddy wants to play too. Let's go play Army Men. Let's go play Bang Bangs. Let's build some bridges. So we'll play with the magnetiles and literally do anything but studying for the exams. That being said, he still had like a lot of distractions. I am insanely proud of him. Hats off to the Mr. Reverend for achieving such a milestone. Like, it doesn't really mean anything immediately. It's kind of like, you can get a degree all you want, but that doesn't mean you get that job the next day. But it's still a really cool thing for him to now like have as he decides where he takes his career at this point. So awesome sauce.
It'll be strutting day in the Reverend household today.
Right? Like, I know I'm supposed to cook dinner tonight, like for multiple reasons. Like, for saving money is one, but also it's like healthier. It's a lot healthier to like eat home cooked food for the most part. But now it's like, man, I want to get something celebratory, don't we, buddy? Hi, baby Reverend. So he might come up and be a little bit more around this morning. But yeah, so just I go back to I'm just incredibly proud of him. It wasn't an easy thing to prepare for. If you know any civil engineers out there in your world prepping to take the PE, you make them some cookies or some muffins and send them love and support and food, because it is not a light feat that he took. It is an 8-hour test. He was there all day. That's actually, we traveled to Portland this past week, and that's what we were primarily there for, was to just be around for this test. And obviously the baby Reverend getting time with Nana and Papa was great, because he loves his Nana and Papa so much so that when inquiring about his future career choices, he very blatantly told us he'd like to be an astronaut, and with no prompting let us know Nana and Papa are going to space with him and that we did not make the cut for space travel. So he's a pretty big fan of getting to spend some time with his Nana and Papa. Got to take the Mr. Reverend and drop him off for his test. We got to take him lunch during his break. But yeah, hopefully he will have a while before any future testing, because the next one is like a multiple days thing. That's if he does that. Not everyone does. I know that look on your face. That's painful for me too. I can't imagine taking a test for days in a row. I mean, they're peppered, like they're scheduled or whatever, but it's like a 4-parter, I think. I don't know. Not my career. But he started explaining like that next step to me. I'm like, whew. Well, you're going to take a break from school for a minute, though, right? Like, I get to have my partner back a little bit more. Like, nobody taking class would be great for just a little bit.
2 weeks. No.
2 weeks.
No, back in my computer repair days, I had to take tests that didn't, take that long or anything like that, but they were still quite intensive, like the A+ certification from CompTIA, and then you got like networking and stuff like that. The networking one kicked my butt, and I still ended up not passing it. It ultimately didn't help that ultimately my passion was just not in computer repair. So, I didn't, me not passing it was not a huge shock or anything like that. But just the thought of, preparing for it and then being in a room, having them like take your phone and all that stuff, because, you got to make sure, you're doing the job correctly and all that stuff and not cheating and everything. But,
Right.
man, the stress
And it was like
involved.
that too. Yeah, he had a locker that he had to put everything in. There was a list of approved items. There was a list of you have to have someone inspect it, but you can have it items. And then there was a list of absolutely nots. And like he couldn't wear his smartwatch, his watch at all, really. His phone had to be left. It was their copy of manuals. You couldn't have any personal copy of any of the manuals for formulas that you'd use. But yeah, it was intense. He did it. It was awesome. I'm so glad we got to be there locally so that we could bring him food. My bonus son actually had decided to spend the weekend with us. Like he learned that we were there and went, I can spend time with my dad and my Zizi. And so like he wound up basically just crashing at Anna's with us and got to come with us and hang out. It was a really good weekend, though. We got to go and see my oldest stepdaughter's performance that they were involved in. They do the sound. And so it was like kind of nice because it was the first time the Mr. Reverend and I like got to see one of her performances together then. Like, and not having to do like either me going because, somebody's got to watch the baby or just him, or it was just kind of nice to get to experience that together and see a high school version of Chicago, which is a lot like the movie version, but with almost none of the dialogue scenes. It's just all of the music and the dancing and the fun stuff. If you can catch, it was just so funny to me because it was pitched. I'm not making fun of this school's thing, just making that abundantly clear. But when I had read, it was like the teen version, I just would have expected there to be any difference other than just it didn't have the dialogue scenes like in the movie. Pretty much all that had been cut. And I get it because it's even kind of doing the more fun parts, right? Like everybody's getting to do like the cool shows and the cool costumes because Chicago is such a fun costume event. It is a fun one to watch, especially when you watch like high school performances. And I actually got to confirm this with my kiddo later of like, wasn't that the same kid that played Mr. Green in Clue last year? And wasn't that Mr. Green's coat? Um, so just kind of having that appreciation of recognizing costume reuse. Like you don't got to sell that one on me, because then she was like, "Well, watch, because you'll see Professor Plum's costume again on the Doctor later." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that's funny!" Like,
Yeah, that's one thing they don't tell you about in regards to parenthood, having to sit through stuff like that. Obviously, as a parent, you're going to be proud of your kid, but, hearing like some random 10th grader's interpretation of Mr. Cellophane is not on my, checklist of things to do before I die.
right. I love that there's like this one kid, and Tim Curry got a clone out into this high school. And like even this kid's energy is so just Tim Curry. Not only does he look a whole lot like Tim Curry, just straight, and that's a compliment, by the way, because Tim Curry is classically trained. That's what was so funny about taking Rocky Horror Picture Show, is a little bit of a to his parents. Um, but like it's funny because I got to make the joke to my stepdaughter of like, I know this is not something you would actually say, but it's weird because I recognize like I would hang out with this high school boy, but like not in like a weird way. He just like has that theater kid energy that seems like I bet you'd be cool as shit. Like I get that we're on totally different like life areas. Like we probably actually wouldn't in reality have anything much to talk about. Like you look like Tim Curry. Like that's probably all I'd honestly have to say to this kid, like on repeat. Like you look like Tim Curry, and every time I see you get on stage, like I know I'm gonna like what you do. Whatever antics you get up to, you have done something to make this you and yours, and that's like such a cool thing to see in like a high school kid performance. But yeah, so that was also really really fun times. High school performances can be so delightfully great.
Or
especially
not.
like, well, or not. And I think like some of that experience comes from size of school. So talent pool, talent interest. Like, let me tell you, from where I hailed from, the little high school in Farmersville, Texas, we did not have top shelf talent doing those plays. Now, that being said, I still could not get any of the roles of our school plays. So you have to take that with a grain of like everything. But it also, like, everything can be in smaller towns, especially back then. Like, everything really can be more about the town hierarchy and popularity than necessarily a child's talent. Because sometimes it really is the parents who gave money to the school whose kids magically always got into the school plays and stuff like that. Like, that being said, like, I was in the background, I was involved, but I was never like a main person.
Well, now you are, and our friends are here to witness it.
Yes. Hello to our friends today. Welcome to Friends Talking Nerdy. We are both the hosts. I am the Reverend Tracy, and I'm leading a little bit more of this month being focused on May is for your mom. And since I am both a mom and a stepmom and all of those things, it seems super appropriate to not have Tim mansplain it, but rather have me mansplain it instead. Isn't that right, Tim?
Yeah. I don't think proclaiming anything about motherhood would hit the right notes compared to how you would be able to do it.
Exactly. And then I will obviously have the chatters of my son, who is insisting that I need to find a bike for him right now. So I actually need to step away for just 1 second before we get into the opening, Tim.
That's right, everybody, because it is very important that the baby Reverend get that bike, people.
So basically, last time where we went into what I would say is cause, right? Like, we learned that motherhood is not just a role that we step into magically one day. It is, there are physical changes, there are neurological changes. So that is kind of cause. Today's theme is more around the effects of that motherhood, right? Like, so last time, motherhood causes some change. However, that mothering that we experienced, us as adults, had a lot of influence. So this is more of like the effect. So motherhood and how it shapes us specifically. Because before you knew who you were, somebody taught your nervous system what relationships feel like, for example. That'll be a big theme of this one because, like we said, we talked about what happens when they become a mom, but that environment is what you grew up inside of. Right. So we get that there is this cognitive load. There were all these things going on physically and neurologically with our parents. Now, they didn't have a lot of information to understand what was going on. So they probably dealt with that as best as they could. And so this is more talking about, yeah, them not having access to all the knowledge we have today did affect our raising, right? Because we didn't learn relationships through explanation. We learned them through experience, through tone, consistency, responsiveness, patience. And so when a parent's tone, consistency, responsiveness, and patience is largely influenced by the culture at the time and access to information at the time, there is an element of that to consider. Especially, there's a lot of articles out there and a lot of speaking out from the millennial generation about our parents and how there's like this big divide. But I think if we take away that context of what happened between their parenting and our parenting, we're robbing ourselves potentially of even some healing that might be necessary. Okay. Because I do want to be clear, this is not about assigning blame. This is about understanding your first experiences of connection and how that became a blueprint your brain now uses to interpret relationships now.
Because I think, we've pointed it out in the past that it is important to remember the context of why things were done at a particular time. I mean, that's what they tell you to do when, you're learning about stuff in history. You don't want to compare what life was like in the 1960s to what it's like today, because you can't. What happened in the 60s was a result of what happened in the 60s, and what happened today is, what happened today. It's like
Yes.
it's like the people that want to judge old time movies based on today's standards. It's like, you can still have those opinions that, an old time movie is like Gone with the Wind. Let's throw that out there. Is has many bad elements to it, being that it is kind of an apologist for the South and the Civil War and all that stuff. But for the time that it came out, and also for the filmmaking aspects of it, there are a lot of positives that you can't really ignore when it comes to that movie. And I think understanding the context, taking it back to parenthood is important, because understanding why parents made the decisions they made at that particular time with the information they had makes it easier for you to hopefully break that chain, break that cycle that
Yeah, I was
can
going to say,
inevitably happen.
yep, cycle breaking is big in our social media speak and psychology speak too. That is one that actually does, for the most part, those messages do align to what would be considered actual cycle breaking. I know we've talked a bit about the social terms don't always meet the psychological terms, but that one, for the most part, seems to be holding for now. And right, so this is like going to go into more like potentially why we are the way we are. And so I'm a bit excited about that, because there is a lot that forms us before we make any active decisions as to what media we take in, what books, what self-help we listen to, what advice we blow off. Like, a lot of stuff happens so early, because there's a whole area of psychology that looks at this, at the fact that relationships and how they form, right? One of the key ideas is that early relationships don't just affect how you feel in the moment, they shape how you interpret relationships later, right? There's a psychologist, John Bowlby, and he talked about this as forming a kind of emotional foundation, essentially. The idea is that your brain is constantly asking, what happens when I need something? And that's like more than food, right? Like when we realize, like, yeah, sure, the baby is crying because they are hungry. But the real things that are happening right now is not necessarily what we see, right? Like just like when you become a mom, there's a lot physically you see happening. So, yes, the baby is hungry. The baby needs to eat. The baby has a dirty diaper. It needs to be cleaned. But really, what's going on, like in the head, in the meat computer at that time, is you're starting to form those early relationship ideas of when I have needs and I say I have those needs, are they being met? And I think we can really easily see the parallels to older life relationship, right? Because needs being met is such a common topic in couples therapy, or even couples who talk about maybe wanting couples therapy. But yes, before you're even consciously aware of it, your brain is already building expectations about connections and people in your life. So yeah, before we're even aware of it, we're already learning what relationships feel like. And it's based off of baby needs. The baby cries. Is the need being addressed? Is it being acknowledged? And that is what is going to set up your core foundation for relationships through your life and how you deal with them.
Which explains a lot with me.
Right, because like in the whole attachment phase, it's not necessarily like that you learn what's right or wrong. You're learning what feels normal, though, right? Because you don't come with an inherent knowledge of what is healthy and what is not. Our babies are all in like soaking in an observation mode, basically, right? Like, first of all, they're not talking, so what better else is there for them to do than focus on things as they slowly start to be able to be seen? But right, you learn what's familiar, and it's taking in your environment, it's taking in basically passive advice from the people raising you. So that's why that is so important, because attachment isn't about labels. It's not like, hey baby, you're safe, so feel safe. Hey baby, you should be quiet, so be quiet, right? It's all about them interpreting. Did they feel seen? Did they feel safe? Did someone respond when I needed them? Right? And those repeated interactions are what teach your brain what to expect from people. Because I think as much as we've talked about like how the brain works, we know one thing for sure. It's a big pattern recognition computer, and it is looking for those patterns. So it starts redonkulously early looking for those patterns and what to expect from people. Because if connection feels consistent, your brain's going to learn that stability. If it felt unpredictable, your brain learns to expect inconsistency. If it felt distant, your brain adapts to distance. Like, and you can kind of almost immediately see how those parallel into adult relationships. like in how people relationship, and not even how they relationship romantically, how they relationship as friends as well.
Yeah, I mean, because I remember when my daughter was born, and very early on, I'd hold her, do whatever. But I'm sure you probably experienced this with the baby Reverend. But how she looked at me was quite interesting, because it was like, even at like a month old, you could see the gears going on in her head when she's looking at you, but she can't, obviously say, "Oh, that's why you do that, Dad," and everything like that. But the observing phase, like, they are watching everything you do.
Right. And that's why they are so incredibly in tune with finding faces that early. Like, even in the womb, they will look for like face patterns. It's been kind of fascinating. That was something I remembered learning at one point while I was pregnant. And I want to say we actually talked about it recently too. But yeah, that psychologist I mentioned, John Bowlby, was the one who really built out this whole idea. That what he thought he was observing is that kids don't just form emotional bonds, they form expectations through those bonds. And this is all going to go into, that secure attachment theory. More parents, like, I wore the baby Reverend. Tim can probably attest to that, because I know we did talk some, and there were some recordings I did, and he was just worn on me. And so the idea is like, yeah, you're creating secure attachment not only for your bond with your kids, so they know to come to you. There's no question as to who they come to. There is also the, I want my son to have secure attachments in their relationships that I did not learn to have until I was in my 30s. Right. Because, and we'll get into that as we go through some of this, because we will talk about the really cool phenomena, the idea of reparenting yourself. Because, yeah, my parents didn't know that something as simple as just wearing me would cause less distress, cause more bond, cause me to be more secure, right? Because there's a lot of like, you're spoiling that baby by holding it all the time. And it's like, no, no, there's literally nothing that backs that. Actually, like, not securing your baby might be causing them to be more insecure than wearing them all the time, is what a lot of this is kind of finding. But, and then going forward, that Mary Ainsworth person, she expanded on it by basically studying how kids responded when a caregiver left and came back. And what she found is that kids weren't just reacting in the moment, they were showing patterns that they had already been learning, like at home. So, like, and that goes back to it's holding. It's more than just like, oh my gosh, this person is my whole world and everything. Like, they are learning like how to act when somebody physically leaves a room, and therefore like when they leave, like that's what they're finding, is that these patterns, carry over. So even early on, the brain is building the kind of prediction system. It's asking, when I need something, what happens? And that answer becomes the foundation for how you approach pretty much all of your relationships later on. And it goes back to friendship, to romantic. I know you're laughing because we're learning. That's what was so fudging fascinating about learning psychology in college, was the laughing at myself and self-application of like, oh, okay, I do need therapy. Got it. Like, oh my gosh, who helped me form how to attach? Maybe that's why my relationships were so fudging unsuccessful until into my 30s. Like, maybe, and again, I am going to touch on, there is value in assessing whether or not your parents realistically did as best as they could with the information that they had access to. I will talk about the privilege of having a pocket computer at my side pretty much the entirety of my pregnancy and the baby Reverend's raising. Like, that is such an extreme privilege to have. But yeah, like, we can learn how to set better things like that. Like, maybe wearing the baby is a good idea. Maybe sleeping with them in close proximity is pretty smart. Maybe it makes sense that they don't like to be in a room by themselves really early on. Like, I'm not judging any parent for making decisions like based on their child's development, right? Like, one kid being ready at two to sleep in a room by themselves because they honestly sleep better. Like, you're following your kid's cues, and that's what's more important. The kid needs to feel okay with being in the room alone more than you need nasty time with your partner at night. Like, I'm just saying, like, maybe there's some levels. I'm not saying like don't put the baby down in the room and get your frake on if you need to. Like, that's important too. But we do need to maybe recognize that these are those little decisions. that seem to really affect the type of relationships your child is going to find easier to have. And I think without it doesn't do justice to not express how important I've learned those things are, and do it in as non-judgmental of a way I can, because I am not saying, haha, I'm so much better than you because I did this. It's just, if we don't talk about the impact these things have, that's where you're not going to break these cycles, and that's where they are just going to continue.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we do have, what you termed the stunt brain, access to all of this information that we didn't necessarily have, at least as freely as we did in the past, is important to recognize it, because kind of like what you're describing too, about how some people say, you shouldn't do this with a baby, you shouldn't do that with a baby. It does seem like a lot of times, especially in the past, before people had, the access to this type of information as freely, they were judging babies' reactions as if these babies were supposed to be adults, if that makes sense. Just
Right.
kind of putting, their own, why would I do that? If I don't do that, then the baby shouldn't do that. But a baby has different needs.
Exactly, exactly. And also, like, I've seen some adults have some pretty amazing temper tantrums. Like, have you ever seen how some people react when somebody drives a little too slow or is like a little too into their lane? Like, I'm sorry, we don't have that down as adults either, right? Like, can we be fair that maybe some of us didn't learn like good emotional regulation? But yeah, and so in addition to that, this is also where some of that secure attachment and like regulation comes in. Because before you had learned how to create calmness, we were actually borrowing it from our parents, particularly the whole mom energy, right? Like, there is, and this goes a little bit of what I talked about, of like where there are some levels of the urgency and prioritization of the baby that does make sense, right? The wanting to hold them, that whole like almost borderline obsession with the new baby makes a lot of sense when you realize how children actually learn how to regulate. And it is through your parent, the one holding you. As a child, you don't have the ability to regulate your own emotions. You actually rely on someone else to help you calm down, feel safe, and make sense of stress. And that process is called co regulation. And this was something that I learned a lot about when the baby Reverend was an infant. And even now, like, especially now that he's getting close to 3, there's a lot more, and this is where I do like the algorithm just a tidge of like kind of putting me in a direction of like, hey, like, if your child is having like a tantrum, actually does better for their system to hug them, to hold them, to remind them to breathe. One of the biggest breakthroughs I had with the baby Reverend actually was realizing, like, God, this kid sucks at breathing. When he needs to calm down, he needs to learn to breathe and calm down, because it's tricky, because you want to acknowledge that the emotion is fine to feel, but you also kind of want to teach, okay, but learning to regulate that is important. And so it was just the idea of, well, have I ever explained how to breathe when he's not in the middle of having an emotional meltdown? And it was just as simple as, hey, buddy, so we're going to practice. Like, sometimes we feel frustrated, we just need to breathe. And so we have this whole routine that we do. And if he's in the mood, we could do a silly one. And if sometimes he's not in the mood for silly and we don't do that. But right, like, so it's called co regulation. You hug on them, you help teach them how to physically calm down. Because we've all felt that, right? When we're pissed, when we're stressed out, when we're confused, we feel like that tension in our body. And so, like, learning how to release that does matter. And over time, those repeated experiences do become internalized. So you showing them physically how to calm down, if that involves hugging them, breathing with them, etc. But yeah, they become your ability to self-regulate. Your parent does. Like, how good you are at that does align with how your parent models the behavior for you. And let me tell you, when you're going through all those mom things, this is where we're going to say we understand more, right? That maybe co regulation wasn't naturally like the drive when you feel overwhelmed, overstimulated, you have your cognitive load on fire all day. Like, we are learning there are reasons moms become yellers. And Right? Because when you're stressed out, think about it. Think about it. Like literally take away the things we just learned about your brain going through stuff like when you become pregnant, right? And stays that way for years. We go back to doesn't start shifting back until year 2. Start shifting back. But when you are in your most stressful period of life that you can think of, when everything was around you at once, how short was your temper, Tim?
Quite, quite
Right? Like
sure.
so it's actually really fudging understandable that moms, and I just go back to because the physical stuff that happens when you give birth and how it almost seems to be that perfect recipe of just stress, mess, and chaos, right? Like it makes more sense because when you learning how to regulate your own emotions was depending on somebody that was like running like that ice thin layer all the time and doing the best they could, but of course they'd snap. And of course they'd yell. Of course they just want you to be happy for a minute. It makes sense. So giving like that compassion that they didn't even know how important it was for them to replicate calm for us.
Well,
So
I agree with you. I also think too, based on my experiences, based on my on the experience I had with my mother, sometimes you just get so lost in the everyday minutia of your own life as a parent that you don't necessarily take that time to think about all of the cognitive load issues that are coming your way. You're just worried about, I got this bill that, needs to be paid, but I don't have the money to pay for it. I have to worry about making dinner. I have to worry about this. I have to worry about this. And then you get a monster truck thrown at your head and it's like, F you at that point. You're losing, you lose your head at that particular point, which doesn't, forgive you for losing your head, of course, as a parent, but it is understandable when you have all of this stuff thrown at you all at once. And, as a parent, you don't necessarily get time for a breather. If you have a partner, of course, you do have a much better chance of doing that than you do as a single parent, for instance. My mother was a single parent raising me and my sister growing up. So she didn't exactly have breaks. And it's understandable. It's understandable.
yeah, and it's like I know I've seen articles about, the stay-at-home parent. It actually is a lot more cognitive load. You end up doing so much more work, like, and more roles for more people. And that's not like a dig or a neg or saying it's somehow easier if you're a working parent, but there is something, and that is likely. I know I haven't recorded it yet and I want to, but I still wanted to do a companion Too Long Didn't Listen for our first mom episode. And that was what I was thinking about drilling into is that, yeah, not only do we have all of this cognitive load going on that is just naturally being kicked up by our brain chemistry, there's also just a lot more going on to like running a house. It is a lot more complicated than it used to be. But yeah, kind of going back to like we learn how to respond in stressful situations, right? Because how did your parent react when they were at their fudging wits end? And they thought they tried everything and just couldn't find, you have no bananas, but the kid wants a banana. And they're just like, so how do you deal with that when it's like just so stressful? Do you shut down? Do you just like, I can't fudging do this and just you're done? Do you like, oh my God, I don't have a flipping banana? Do you escalate? Do you avoid it? Do you stay grounded? Like all of that, that little moment is what's going to teach those things. And no pressure to be perfect all the time, guys. But we can also go into the fact that this is why it actually is kind of important to talk about the fact that we're not perfect as parents, is because that helps kids connect. Like, no, really, we're trying their best and really trying to understand and help me understand that the yelling and the quick to anger wasn't necessarily because of me and my little body. There were other things going on too, right?
And I think that does kind of tie in with what Mr. Rogers said in terms of his advice to grown-ups, in terms of being a parent. And his main advice was, remember what it was like for you as a kid. And I take that to mean, go. I say too much. Future Tim, me, the editor, when I listen back to the show, it's like you don't want to do a drinking game based on me saying because I say it a lot, folks. but the whole remembering as a kid to me says that you as the adult are still going to make mistakes. You're going to blow up at your kid for something silly. The important thing is to talk to them about it afterwards, and that can help with their development growing up, their emotional development, and all that stuff. Because even the best of parents will have bad days, and do something that they're going to be like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Helping with their emotional regulation, it helps to be able to talk to them even at very young ages and be like, Daddy was wrong, Mommy was wrong, or whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, like it's okay to say the words wrong and no and stuff like that. It's just like kids understand a lot more younger than we give them credit for. And I don't know, my tack is I'm just going to be an over explainer from the beginning. He's just so used to me over explaining everything. It will just always be the way it was. It's not like, well, you're 13, let me over explain the world now. And not that I really like do that literally all the time, but right, like understanding how important it is to model. And that includes modeling what to do in those moments that you are not perfect. That you can recognize, like, dude, I am so sorry I yelled. I am. That was scary for me too. I love you. You hug on them. We talk about like potentially how to not do that again later, right? Like as a family, like it's funny because the problem solving conversation is very similar as a young child as to what you would hope they could learn to expect from you when they're older, right? But yes, the whole psychology and a big focus on the idea called co regulation, look into it. It is fascinating. It is also part of what they're considering the fourth trimester now. Of the fact of like having physical contact with your parent is super important and actually helps regulate some of the breathing and some of like the heart rate and stuff like that while they're sleeping. So there's a lot to being in physical proximity of your kid because that quickness to respond when they're that little baby translates to something older. And also having better sleep yourself is pretty good. If that's something that you're comfortable with doing, if you can look up any like safe co-sleeping stuff, like because if you think that doesn't help you as the parent with being able to regulate better is getting better sleep, I'd say that's part of the recipe there. Of, we go back to we're encouraged as parents, very confusingly so, the more that I learn about like young child development, as I'm kind of learning as I'm doing with the baby Reverend, is like, yeah, we're like, oh my God, they're two and they're not sleeping in their own room yet. I'm like, well, yeah, why would he? Like now that I've learned a little bit more, I'm like, well, yeah, why would he? What is this American obsession with like your kid can't share a room with you? I don't like sleeping alone. Like I personally prefer to have a roommate, like literally in the room. We don't have to do anything. We can just cuddle. But but basically, this is all of those things that create what would be like your personality blueprint, right? Like all of these internal working models. So all of those little things build, and going into it with that understanding, both what that means for anybody who is or plans to or has recently gone through parenthood, but also understanding like how that affects us as adults, right? Because there's a little bit where you can be like, okay, so I didn't get a USB packet uploaded into my brain of how to emotionally regulate. There were some skills that maybe my parents probably didn't even know, because how much in the 80s and 90s were adults even aware of the term self regulation or emotional regulation, right? So, what chance did they have to even know to model it or have it themselves while they were raising us in one of the more stressful times of like not being able to just look up stuff on your phone, right? But, right, like basically, we're taught how our relationships to the world and our relationship to other people are working, whether our parents liked it or not. That's what we were learning during probably one of their most stressful time periods, because it creates a set of expectations about so much, about how love works, about how conflict works, whether people are reliable, or whether you yourself are worthy of care. Because that's how some of that can translate as well, too, right? Like into depression, for example. And that model is constantly running in the background of your life. And it is just so incredibly set by how your parent knew how to parent at the time. And this is, again, it goes back to the flaw in common sense. Common sense is only as good as the context, the time, and the culture that it exists in.
Exactly, because not as we've talked about in previous episodes, not everybody. I said, again, your people don't all have the same access to things like mental health care, for instance. The single mother that has two jobs, that's trying to raise a couple kids on her own, isn't necessarily going to have time to either go to therapy or even read like some sort of a parenting book or something like that. She's going to be worried about getting to work, paying the bills, making lunch for the kids so they can head off to school or something like that. And it's different compared to someone who has a 5, 6, or 7 figure income, has a loving partner or partners, depending on if they're polyamorous, of course, in their lives, helping out whenever they can. It's just everybody is at a different spot.
Right. And this even goes into some of the dynamics we talked about with the loss of the multi generational home, because there used to be more people for the testing pool of how do I rely on people, right? There used to be the grandparent in the home, there used to be the older siblings that stayed, right? The expectation wasn't to move out at 18, they stayed, and therefore they became part of that reliability model, right? Because this whole thing is called, in attachment research, they call it an internal working model, right? It goes back to, it's your template for relationships. And it's not something that we consciously think about. It's not something that we like, oh, well, I like how my big sibling does this, I don't like how they do that. Like, you're going to see and learn by what you're witnessing as a child. And like, so basically, it happens so early that often it just feels like reality and not an interpretation, but it is an interpretation of what was around you, right? It's not something you consciously think about. It's something that quietly shapes how you interpret behaviors between different relationship styles and relationships. And that's why two people can experience the exact same situation and react completely differently because they're not just reacting to what's happening now. They're reacting through the lens of what they learned in these early stages, right? And this goes back to, especially as we go through life and we don't learn how to challenge things. We don't learn, like, hey, I can teach myself emotional regulation now, right? I feel like that hasn't hit a lot of us until we're in our 30s or 40s, that we can actually, like, right? Because I go back to that Marilyn Monroeism that she may not have even said, of like, if you can't accept me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. And like, how that's kind of become this weird mantra of, well, my shit does stink, but you need to ignore that. I don't need to change anything about my diet. I don't need to spray stuff in the bathroom before I go. My poop stinks, and your job is to deal with that if you want me at my best. And that is like not supported by anything. That is a horrifically, I feel, if anything screams narcissism, it's that. It's like, the nope, you are just to love me and my crappy behavior all together, right? And never question it. Like, no, we should be questioning these things. We should absolutely question how we react in an emotional moment. We should be working on not having emotionally reactive conversations. But I go back to how many people that are like that, and probably got it from their own parents and how they interacted, because we go back to, well, yeah, there's a lot of things that were normalized in our generation's parents, right? And in the baby boomer generation, now in the millennial generation, our kids are going to have the stuff that they need to reparent them on. And I think the earlier we can accept that in our younger years, when our brain is more plastic, the better it will be for those relationships, because we can actually be the space that our parents weren't for us. We can actually hear that our crap stinks and maybe be able to say, well, but poopery wasn't invented yet. And when I learned about it, I did buy some. You know what I mean? Like, being willing to challenge that I'm a good parent identity by understanding that you can't possibly know everything. Right. And then also having that grace of, you do need to learn, not just for yourself, but also if you're going to have kids, if you really want to break some of these cycles that we feel is so common, we have to be willing to be like, yeah, my crap stunk every Sunday. Maybe it was because of that egg dish I used to make every Sunday morning. Just who really made it stinky. I didn't realize what was going on, but but that's what was going on. So I quit making the egg dish every Sunday morning, you know?
I swear I quit eating garlic. Come on.
Exactly, exactly.
but
But
I
yeah,
but yeah, I can say from my experience too that it is important as a parent to older kids, young adults. You could say to admit when you were wrong as a parent. I
yeah,
think that's been one of the most fulfilling things as a parent myself that in terms of the experience with my kids that I have right now, just me being able to say, yeah, I effed up doing X, Y, and Z, because I think that is part of the way that you as a parent can help your kids break that, cycle of stupidity that does seem to go from generation to generation to generation, just because, life can make it to where not everybody, again, has that time to necessarily sit back and, do that reflection or go to therapy or something like that. You can still help when your kids are adults.
yes, you absolutely can because you're still normalizing things like well into adulthood for our kids. Look at how we know that the brain is still developing until 25, right? Like there's still a lot. And I think a lot of it needs to be building that trustworthy relationship that your kids can feel that they can rely on you to have tough conversations and not bite their head off. Right? Because if you had that relationship with your kid, and this is a lot of what I feel happens between the whole boomer millennial generations right now, is that our expectation as millennials was you didn't ask questions. You didn't ask whether or not their actions were correct. That was just your expectation was to understand they were doing their best. Meanwhile, all of psychology points to doing as I say and not as I do, or doing as I say because I say it, like does not translate well to any human brain, not an adolescent, not an adult, right?
Well, I
So
think
it's
so.
like, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of it comes down to pride as well. I remember my mother's reactions to, like my sister or me talking to her about, stuff that happened when we were kids. And it seemed like to her, it was like a pride thing. Like, how dare you? How dare you say I was wrong after everything I did for you? And it's like, I get why the initial reaction was to do that, but as a parent, you kind of need to fight that unless what your kid is saying absolutely didn't happen, and and you have every right to defend yourself. But let's be honest, that is not usually what's happening when your kid is bringing something up like that. It happens.
Well, at least in their reality, right? Because so just a really quick touch on two things, because this again is so relevant with what's going on with millennials and their baby boomer parents right now. Is I think this is the intersection of identity threat because it is like the equivalent of somebody drawing back to hit you, right? When they feel like their identity is being threatened, and especially as mothers of those generations, you identify as a good mother, and so I can understand now, knowing what I know, how it could be very hard to hear. Like, actually, we now know that this is probably how things should have been done because it is taken like a personal attack, right? So there is that part of that. Their identity feels attacked when we try to have these conversations, and especially if they haven't developed that plasticity enough neurologically to be more open to learning things as they get older, like, hey, we can still talk about this stuff now, right? So there's that going on. And then there's the other fact of the matter that we've been no stranger to talk about here is our memory is incredibly flawed as humans. So it is very, very much a reality that my Karen really does remember things differently than I remember them. And when I tried to have a healing conversation over a particular string of abuse that happened for me, Karen's terrible fucking reaction was to tell me that I remembered it wrong. I'm sorry you remembered it wrong, which is like straight. That is like some of the stuff that hits our meme social media reels of like, yeah, that's a narcissism thing, right? That is like so like, don't check me. That is some narcissistic parent, some narcissistic person of like, well, I'm sorry you don't remember that correctly. That is like such a gaslighty from the book of how to gaslight people phrase. And so, but we do need to recognize that though, that when we have these conversations, it is very real that two people can experience the same thing and remember it differently as time goes, especially if nobody journaled about it and if the conversation was not kept open since the happening of it. Because our brain, natural preservation, right? So it is going to naturally want to tilt stories more in your favor.
Yeah, and I understand that instant reaction, I guess, of, well, hey, I kept a roof over your head. had clothes on your back, food in your belly, and all that stuff. How could I be that bad? Because no parent is trying to go and mess their kid up for life. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, and if your identity is that you just don't care about kids, that's how that happens. Nobody has a kid and goes, I'm going to fuck you up. Like, nobody does that. It all comes from a place of lack of caring. It comes from a lack of caring. And that's where that really anchors in from. So, all of that to say, yeah, there's like underlying factors going on that potentially not everybody fully understands or maybe respects is the better term, that like kind of hinders healing some of that wound, some of the mother wound, the parent wound, whatever you want to call it, whoever your wound is with your experienced parent. Like there's some barriers getting in the way of that because you have to respect how memory works and you have to respect identity threat. And I think both people need to, right? Both the child that wants to heal with the parent, but the parent also needs to understand that that's why they're reacting that way, right? But even that kind of goes into another thing we've talked about, because I know we've talked about like some of the stuff with identity threat and things like that before and how memory happens. But there's also this thing that we've talked about, I want to say possibly in like a New Year's episode of pattern repetition. Like why does familiar win over sound logic? And being somebody who, as I've joked before, many a therapist has told me I intellectualize, I find it infuriating that this is just how our brain works, that we want familiar more than I can't logic rock myself into just like doing the better habits. I literally have to make them familiar. And that is where it's so funny that of all of the weird adages out there that actually does align to psychology, there is something about faking it until you make it, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why familiarity wins, right? And basically, it all goes back to what was our brain doing in those early years, Tim? It was observing, right? It was figuring out what's my world? What am I coming into, right? Because that's what establishes what's familiar, and familiar is safe even when it logically isn't. And this goes back into, I know we've talked about this before, of like kids being in different households sometimes. Like it's not necessarily that the household they want to go to is the better household for them. Sometimes it's the one that they've just been more exposed to. And therefore, it feels familiar, it feels normal, that feels safe. Things that don't align with that don't feel safe. And I want to say the example we've talked about this before is like, for example, like living with the mom who's maybe more of a yeller and maybe never really reined that in, right? And let's say the second household doesn't have that element to it, right? Would on paper would seem healthier, like the parent or parents talk about things and expect having a conversation, not just a yelling match, right? And even though you would think if you asked a kid, like, would you prefer to be yelled at or would you prefer to be talked to calmly? You would think they'd pick the talk to calmly, but that's not how that works. They're going to pick what feels familiar, what feels normal, because that is how our brain is programmed to. That is what is safe. And this also bleeds into that early cognitive bias we've talked about before called familiarity bias. It gets in our way so much. It's going to ruin your New Year's diet. It's probably already tanked because come on, we're into May now. Um, it's being that draw to familiar. And the fact that your brain just prefers what it recognizes because recognition feels safer than uncertainty. So even if a pattern isn't healthy, if it is familiar, if it feels comfortable, It therefore feels predictable, and it is just what you're going to align to. This goes back to our brain likes it better when an action has a negative consequence than when an action has no consequence, or we don't know what the action is going to result in. We would rather take the things that we know or even an unknown than trying something that's not predictable. And that's why people often find themselves in similar dynamics over and over again. It's why you keep ending up in I date the same guy. It's like you hear it in our dating culture, right? Like people being frustrated with themselves and their own decision making. But then it's like the questioning stops. And it's something that I'm very glad that eventually I got so frustrated with that I unpacked it, because that's what taught me about some of this stuff and realizing how I was potentially seeking out my own abusers effectively for a while based on how I was acting and what I was looking for, because it was familiar. Because when your life and your childhood is all chaos, it feels weird to not have that chaos. This is something that when you go into trauma therapy, they will talk to you about that, because you have to be the one that recognizes, wait a second, this is bad chaos. I should not continue to pay into bad chaos being in my life, but you have to be cognizant to make those decisions. And that is the problem, is we are fighting our brain's familiarity bias by just wanting things to be healthier. It is already going to go, yeah, but I know how this relationship's going to work. It's going to be really great. They're going to love bomb the crap out of me. And then at some point, they're just going to start being a dick. And it's going to get really bad and toxic. We're going to yell at each other a lot until somebody finally crosses that line that gives me permission to be like, bye. And I feel like that is such a hyperbolic yet accurate example of most relationships that I watch fail, where I like talk to friends early as like, and I don't try to be like, you should break up with them now. It was more like one thing that played out that is still kind of playing out, so I won't name names, is like, I kind of feel like from the beginning there was a huge red flag at a very important core, what I would call like a price of admission level thing. Like one person's price of admission was totally different than the other person's. And that is still such a chaotic relationship years later that I'm like, okay, well, now this person's here and this person's here. I wonder if I'm going to get the, oh, we're getting divorced text here. And like at some point, because I mean, I get giving things a shot, but there's also the having the honest conversations so that you can help yourself, especially if you feel like you have a pattern of bad relationships. Yeah, your picker might be bad. And there is something that can be kind of damaging to having that narrative. So instead of like, well, my picker's bad, so there's nothing I can do about it, there is more worth in my picker's bad, but so maybe I should assess the picker, calibrate the scale, as it were, like instead of just working off a defunct scale, can we look up like Google, how do I fix this? How do I recalibrate my scale because it's not working, right?
Yeah, and it again ties into how important it is for parents, especially of adult children, to be able to have those open conversations with their kids about what they could have done a better as a parent, because it's stuff like that that can help them break the cycles of stuff that continuously happens over generation after generation.
And this is stuff that we've talked about too, that's like been fairly normalized in our media culture about how couples fight and it's got to be some big thing to break up over, right? But yeah, and if you think about like if you've ever watched that play out between your parents, if you've watched that play out, because I go back to, we're also kind of the divorce generation, so we saw our parents divorce and date like at a rate that no other generation saw before. I did not look that up, so please feel free to correct me if I am totally off base, but I am fairly certain that we were of at least the higher divorce rate, so therefore at least more ability to be exposed to the fact that adults date, right?
No fault. Yeah, no fault divorce became the thing, I guess, in the 70s. So when it first hit, yeah, the numbers of divorces did skyrocket, but once it got to a particular point, then it kind of plateaued and stayed at about the 50%. I believe it's like 50%, right? Like,
Well, I guess more of what I'm talking about is it was still, you could divorce, but a lot of people still chose not to date again early on. And so I'm thinking of where it probably happened logically in my little tinfoil hatted half the time brain that sometimes rattles around good ideas, is that I think there is an intersection of both divorce becoming more acceptable and online dating, because it made it easier to kind of shop. You didn't have to find time to go to somewhere and meet somebody. You didn't have to worry about what men were actually single at your church or whatever thing you did. It expanded your ability to basically shop and date, not just in your town, towns over. So that's just a personal, like what I felt from my raising was, yes, I saw my mother, my Karen on like whatever dating website, OK Cupid, I think was a super early one, and stuff like that, like match.com, like Plenty of Fish. Like there was just such a more access to see dating. And then you also can combine that with how we watch dating play out in so many movies and so many shows. Right? Think about the adage, like even my adoptive parents love them to death. Once told the Mr. Reverend and I, you guys need to just fight more. And the Mr. Reverend are like, no, we don't need to fight like you guys bicker. That triggers, like, who that does things to me. But they're healthy about it. Like overall, by the way, like their bickering is fine. It might remind me of some of the fighting that happened in my childhood, but it is not on the same weight class of fighting that happened when I was a child around me. But basically, just being exposed to it more, like by our parents dating, by seeing more of it in media. Right. And that looks like research done by Dutton and Painter. And they looked at something called traumatic bonding. And that probably sounds familiar to anybody familiar with therapy speak. But what they found is that when connection is inconsistent, AKA when it's really intense sometimes and super absent others, it can actually strengthen attachment. So, and it makes me think, so even if a relationship is stressful, if that stress feels familiar, it can still feel like the right place to be, because the brain then is linking emotional intensity with connection, that you just need to fight sometimes, that there's no passion in this relationship, right? Like we see where this is kind of a toxic thing that we've been like low dosed into accepting, but it's not really necessary. And there's not a lot of psychology that backs, like, okay, yeah, if you never have a disagreement ever, that's not good, right? Like somebody is probably not expressing their wants. Like you should have disagreements where you talk. However, no, those disagreements should not just be explosion. They shouldn't just be explosion of emotion with like no resolution, right? But when we really think about how quickly this gets programmed early now, and how much we probably saw our parents fighting again at their most sleep deprived and stressed out times, and with no access to knowledge to even be prepared for that. Like, of course, they probably modeled a lot of the stuff that has now been normalized in our media, that we can kind of, when we sit here and talk about it, it seems so easy to see how toxic that is. How,
Yeah.
yeah, like force fitting a relationship until somebody misbehaves bad enough is not how to treat people. Having the passive aggressive crap that happens when you're stressed out and living in a home together, like displaying that for your kid when they're in sponge mode, and realizing that, yeah, that does have an effect. And if we never talk about it, they're not going to even know that that's an option to talk about it. Or if all of your resolution happens in another room, like they're never going to see the repair portion of that modeling we talked about that is so incredibly important.
Disagreements happen between people, of course. They happen between romantic partners, and your kids will see that. I don't get why people would say you need to fight more. I don't get that logic, right?
Like I said, it goes back to that there's no passion. If you're not like at each other every now and then, you must not be describing what you want. Or we were raised in homes where that happened, and thankfully we both decided we don't want that. Like, are we perfect, and does it have, like, I'm not saying that we never have disagreements that maybe get a little bit too heated, right? I'm not going to pretend that we're perfect, because we need to stop that. Like, right, I think like some of our stuff talking about social media is we have got to stop pretending like we're perfect and our life is great all the time, because we are normalizing some really weird crap. We are helping normalize people staying in very unhealthy relationships because everybody else looks like they're successful. That actually maybe falls more under the failure gap, right? Like that I talked about in a Too Long Didn't Listen recently, of we grossly misunderstand how often things fail, including relationships. Like that was one of those things that came up too. So just interesting little side listen if you didn't catch that one. But
Hint, hint, yeah.
hint, hint. Yeah, go listen to my new segment. I'm working on getting it out every Wednesdays. Not right now because I've had a weird week. But travel weeks, be damned. I'm going to be better about it. So going into, I guess, like kind of going towards closing this up, let's talk about the generational context and the bias check that we can practice here as we are the adults wanting to heal from this, right? We're wanting to heal from our parents being at each other's throats because stress was high and sleep was low, largely thanks to us needing to poop at midnight. You know what I mean? Like we can talk about it. And I think understanding these things, I don't want to say like, if your parents abused you, they were probably trying their best. I'm not saying that. So please apply anything following this with the best of intention of I'm not talking about abusive parents, right? I am talking about at the end of the day, can we unpack some of what our parents did and understand that there are signs of life that they were trying their best in the cultural time and context, right? Because we're judging the past with tools they didn't even have. It goes back to if your parent did have the time to read a parenting book, which one? Was it actually like a well-known person, or is it just like, well, this person got their parenting book at my local library, I'll read that one? And there were stuff that came out that was not necessarily great, that parents sometimes read, right? So we do need to appreciate what we have now, right? I had an app that got to tell me when to go to the hospital because of my contractions. I had an app that told me every developmental stage for my boyo, like as he was growing, both in my stomach and outside of. Like I got to have that, right? Because we're the first generation with this level of access to information, not just about like physical health, but mental health and attachment and emotional development in real time, if we can get past the cognitive load to look at it, right? So that's more of like what to take away from this now. Like we've got that. We have research in our pockets. We have therapy language ready to use, and we have frameworks ready to deploy. Like, and that is like so much that our parents didn't have. Like every stage of this kid's nap schedule, I found a website and I loved her and it was amazing. And so like every month I would read like, okay, here's what I can expect in month 3 of this little hooligan coming up, and like the rapid fire of everything that's going on in your life as they're being raised. Because it's like, just as you set patterns around them being 3 months old, well, now you got a 4-month old and it's totally different than a 3-month old for some reason, because that's how rapid that changes. That's part of what is contributing to that cognitive load, right, that we talked about last time.
And I'm sure if you picked up like parenting books, for instance, from like the 80s and 90s and compared them to today, there would be a lot of overlap, of course, but there would be things that are different because, I mean, you've talked about the mental health manual that people, what do they call that?
The DSM.
Yes, the DSM.
Yeah.
How that has changed over the years as well. Just because new information coming out, you want to update it, and like even some like one popular childhood person growing up that parents listened to a lot was like Dr. Spock. Right. And there were still multiple versions of Dr. Spock books, like version
So which
2,
one
version
did your
3.
library have?
Yes.
It goes back to, right? Like, and it's not like the back of the book is be like, by the way, there's like 6 other editions after this one. Like, you had what was there and what the librarian could help you with, right? And so, like, exactly. So they were working off what they were shown and what their culture normalized. And if you knew about Dr. Spock, you might know to pick up his book. If you pick up Dr. Larry's, like, always spank your kids, it's good for their future book, you were working off of that. And this is a new bias that we get to talk about. I don't think we've brought this up before. We may have. I don't think we've really emphasized it. This is where something called the hindsight bias comes in. And that's essentially the bias where it's really easy to look back and say, well, that was obvious. But in reality, it wasn't really obvious back then. Because hindsight bias is basically the tendency to look at past situations with the privilege of your current knowledge and assume that people should have known what we know now. This is more or less my problem with common sense. is hindsight bias is one of those things. But like you said, knowledge evolves. The manuals that we use to teach doctors change all the time. The manuals we use in the DSM is the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual. So that's what DSM stands for. That changes as we learn things. It goes back to homosexuality used to be in there. We learn things and we take it out, right? We learn things and we put them in, right? But that's basically that tendency to look back with your privilege of current knowledge saying, well, that should have been common sense, right? So when we apply today's understanding to yesterday's behavior, we are not just analyzing it, we're unintentionally distorting it, right? Because we are trying to put our parents in the cultural context of today that did not exist then, right? And this can go back to another thing we've talked about is intention does not erase impact, though. And that's the other half of this, right? But it does change how we understand where it came from. So I think there is more healing to be had when you can apply this where it makes sense with your parents, right? And I go back to a big one is spanking. That is such a hot topic between the millennial and our parent raising generation of you spanked me. And it feels so obvious now that that is abuse. That is an abusive action. How could you do that? Meanwhile, under the reality back then, that culture did not view spanking as abuse. It actually viewed it as good parenting, and therefore that's the message that was out there. And if we're able to tap into that as an example, granted, if your parent picked up a belt and like chased you through the house, I would say the millennial generation was probably of a generation that you should not have experienced that. Because I knew I wanted to use spanking as an example. That's why I wanted to head this with there is a difference between a parent that you can go, okay, maybe they were trying their best, and a parent who just like laid out every piece of stress on you. Right? Big, huge, going to have respect for that big difference. But if we can maybe see our parents through the lens of, okay, and if you had it in your mind, like up until recently, like, yes, spanking is abuse. It's always abuse and they should have known. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if your situation could be unpacked of okay, my parents weren't abusive. They actually were trying their best with the information they had on hand at the time. I would say that could lead to some healing. It unfortunately does not apply to everybody, right? Because the fact of the matter is, experts best, last time I looked at this number, best can assume 1 in 7 kids experience, in a given year, experience abuse or neglect. And that is a significant number of kids. That means you line up all the kids in your kids' class that year. Every 7th one, just pull them forward because they're experiencing that this year. Now,
the
important way to phrase that is in a given year, right? That's not saying like that child is every year, right? But that's still significant enough to understand that that's what was going on, right? And that there are ways to therefore look at it and be better and everything like that. But no, they didn't have as much access to materials to even know that what they were doing was potentially as harmful as it was, right? And like that whole the past situations, the hindsight bias is a big one that I think we do need to embrace for our own healing as well, right? Because it doesn't even matter if your parent has long passed away. If it helps you to maybe challenge some hindsight bias and use that to challenge how you were raised, I think it's going to make you more effective at what's called reparenting yourself, right? Because you kind of need to know what to reparent and you need to have that honest conversation on that then. And if the honest truth is that your parent spanking you with a paddle was them really trying their best and that they were not in fact trying to hurt you, I could just see that being of a great benefit. Versus the person who unpacks the same thing and goes, no, they were still pretty consistently a dick. That's also valid, super valid. Like in that sense, like it does kind of solidify this opinion. So questioning it at all, I think, leads to either a more secure decision on how that person was, or it allows you to question it of, okay, I was actually loved.
It
Because,
takes in,
right?
yeah, it takes into account nuance, I think, that hindsight bias, because, and we've already talked about it a few times in this episode and as in previous episodes as well. The fact that, again, 2026 is not 1984.
Right.
Things that happened in 1984, that was a different time, a different culture. That doesn't excuse the things that they did that were bad, but taking nuance into account, understanding that that's how things were in 1984 can make it easier to heal in 2026, if that makes sense, because you are taking into account what life was like at that particular point. To your point, yeah, most parents are not going into things like, I am going to intentionally hurt my child and scar them for life for doing this. They are trying their best, but sometimes their best doesn't always cut it. And, hopefully the parent down the road will, have enough humility to say, okay, you're right. I was wrong and I'm sorry. But but the person that needs the healing, it does need to understand nuance more, and not like,
Yes.
because it hurts me in 2026, they should have known that back in 1984.
Right. And I think that's where we can go into the hindsight bias pairs, unfortunately, well, with something called the superiority bias. Right. So, again, these are the biases helping us understand where we block ourselves from healing. Because sometimes the belief that, quote, I would never do that, end quote, can actually keep us more stuck. Right, than actually healing. Because when we learn more, it's natural to look back and feel like we would have done things differently. Right. And this is even part of what plays into why our memory is so flawed. Right. We learn things we want to identify as being a good insert blank. And therefore, that is where sometimes you can start rewriting your own history. It's made me want to journal more. I've more like let go of just like my memory is just going to be what it is. I'm just always going to take other people's interpretation of a moment as their truth, because you can have two truths. The bishop Chris and I want to say we did talk about the whole bagel dog incident story, where we both have a very vivid memory of how that went down. Starts off very different, ends the same for both of us, though, is what is so funny about that story. But yeah, but anyway, so we learn more. We want to look back and say that, yes, therefore we would have done things differently, right? Because we have this knowledge. And that can all be very valid. But if we hold on to that one position too tightly, it can turn into emotional rigidity, which I think that term implies it's not very good for healing a brain. You need flexibility, right? When a bone breaks and it sets wrong, you have to re-break the bone to set it right. So if you are too rigid in how something has formed as a result of it having an experience, it is kind of our job to maybe break that again, right? Because we need to, instead of creating distance, we need to create curiosity around it. Because curiosity is what actually allows processing. The whole we're just going to shut it out and not talk about it news alert doesn't work well for healing. It doesn't work well for healing between two people. It doesn't work well for healing within just yourself. You gotta be curious about what's going on with you mentally. And that is like, it's also kind of tied into the other concept called cognitive dissonance, I'll say that word right, cognitive dissonance, that explains how we try to keep our beliefs and identity consistent. Right. And what's funny is this superiority bias almost like also bumps heads with that identity threat of our parents really wanted to be viewed as, like, they do identify as having been good parents, right? Especially by the mechanisms that maybe they were taught to judge that by. Was your child fed? Did they survive? Did they pass high school, right? Because that changes too. Like the markers we look for of you did good as a parent changes, right? Ours is totally different than what our parents had. And that's why, again, we have that little bit of the hindsight bias and the superiority bias. Like, well, clearly these are the things you should be looking for, of that you raised a good kid. Not just was their belly full, was it full of good food? Not just did you take care of your kid, but did you actually supply support in the home that teaches them to look for support in their relationships? Did you learn how to emulate conversations with them on how to work through a disagreement? Because I guarantee they're going to have them. And you might want to help teach them how to have those healthily. So you're not dealing with a child who is crying to you because their partner is screaming at them, because that is what they have learned fights should look like. right?
Yeah, there are too many parents out there that want medals. They want a pat on the back. They want to be termed the greatest parent in the world for doing the absolute bare minimum that it takes to do the job as a parent. And that's unfortunately not how it goes. Like, with my kids, like I said, they had a roof over their head, clothes on their back, food in their belly. But, I've been open on this show that I feel, hindsight being 2020, I was a bad parent because I was more stuck in the day to day grind of trying to keep everything afloat and not thinking about long term stuff and all that. And, that was to my detriment. And, thankfully, I'm, doing what I can to, make amends for that and make changes for that. So hopefully my kids don't have to repeat some of the same cycles that I did, thanks to my parents and what my parents had to deal with thanks to their parents and so on and so forth.
A little bit more on this before I move into like where this also ties into kind of the reparenting concept, right? But basically, with this whole cognitive dissonance thing and how our brain is just wired to keep our beliefs and identity consistent, or that it's important for us to believe that they are consistent, I think is the better way to phrase that, because we've talked about this before. But if we see ourselves as more aware or more informed, it can actually feel uncomfortable to also acknowledge that same complexity in the people who raised us. This even goes to simplicity bias, right? It is easier to stay in judgment than it is to sit in that complexity of your parent, right? Because where curiosity allows processing, being curious about complexity, though, is where the actual processing happens, if that makes sense. Like, curiosity keeps you open and allowing processing at all, but being curious about how complex people are is where you can actually process more of why they did what they did, and then therefore why you came out the way you came out, so you can do some of that awesome Jungian shadow work and maybe try to become a better person. And this is whether or not you have kids, right? Because you can't change what you were taught, but you can change what you practice now. And this is where reparenting shows up, right? And I want to say probably there's an awareness around this term. I feel like, my algorithm being that I talk more about mental health and care more about it, I see where it maybe hits mine more. But for some people, so basically it's like reparenting is showing up in two main ways, it seems, in our social media and our culture. For some people, it's learning skills that weren't modeled, right? So that goes back to emotional regulation, communication, boundaries, right? These are things that feel like very much in the conversation of what feels messy in relationships between the millennial and the raising generation of the baby boomers, right? And then for others, it's deeper work. It's healing from actual neglect, trauma, and unsafe environments. And those are both very important, right? It's important to recognize that this isn't rare. This goes back to 1 in 7 kids are definitely, if not a systemic pattern of abuse or neglect, at least experiencing it for a year or so, right? Because let's be real, those kids that stepped forward during or freshman year of high school probably also stepped forward during sophomore and junior years too, right? Like, some of those are going to be the same. Some of them will be one-offs because, hey, my mom and dad got divorced that year and my mom was trying to deal with how to work and support us, and there was like all this fighting, and so they were distant. And maybe there was a scoosh, just a sprinkle, a bam flavoring kapow of neglect that year, right? So yes, there's somewhere it's not necessarily abusive or systemic, but for a lot of those kids, it is going to be systemic, right? So it is important to recognize it's not rare, right? It's important to respect those estimates that at least 1 in 7 children are going to, and it is likely underreported, right? Because this is only the found stuff. That's why those things always come with an asterisk. So this isn't about overanalyzing normal parenting, right? But it is about recognizing that for many people, there were real gaps or harm that need to be addressed. And reparenting isn't about blaming your parents, and it really shouldn't be. It is about giving yourself what you didn't consistently receive. And what's great about that is that means you deserve it no matter what their intent was. If their intent was that they were trying to be a good parent and you're able to see that, that's going to go more towards your healing than, well, they were just shit and bad and always shit and bad, right? But there also is something to that too. Like if you can logically put down like, oh, okay, yeah, I way don't need to talk to that person anymore. Like you can move forward kind of securely in that at that point, right? Because it goes with more knowledge is a good thing for healing, especially some of these complex things. Whether that parent intended to or not, there were gaps that were caused. And even the normal ones where it's like we weren't necessarily taught to talk through disagreements. We were accidentally taught that you yell. We were taught that you snap at somebody when they don't do what you expect them to do. I am actually thinking about the parent child thing, right? Like how quick we are to snap.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's also unpacking and therefore reteaching yourself in those elements too.
And it can help the adult child heal. Taking that time to go beyond the concept of my parent was bad, to kind of thinking about things they did, even if they were abusive, finding out kind of like the whys of what your parent did or something like that can make it to where you still decide you don't need to talk to that person anymore, but at least you have a lot more knowledge in your own brain to be able to say, okay, they did X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z was bad. I don't want to repeat it. I don't want them in my life to have it repeated again. But it's still more information. The more information you have, the better,
Right.
basically.
Exactly. Because like just cutting something off, unfortunately, isn't going to stop the pattern from repeating in you. Right? Like if you've got like cancer of the pinky finger, yeah, you can cut off that pinky finger, but you might want to figure out if you need to go through like a round of chemo or treatment to, help anything lingering in the rest of your body. Because, yes, I have no interest in talking to either of my bio parents. They have each earned that very individualistically for different reasons. But, like, that doesn't mean you don't do the self examination, though, to make sure there's not already a little bit of that cancer in you. Right? Like using the cancer analogy, I guess. But, like, so you should not just end it as they did bad, right? This goes back to getting curiosity about the complexity. Yeah, if they were abusive or if they were bad, it does not hurt you and arguably stands to help you to get a little bit curious about that. Now, I'm not saying you need to sit down in the therapist chair and have them explain their childhood to you, but you can maybe be able to unpack the signs that you can see. This even goes if they're not around anymore, right? Like I will totally talk about my personal Karen for a second. That I realized, oh my gosh, she was a child of divorce well before divorce came cool, with a Catholic AF father and a really hippy dippy mother that
Ooh.
wound up then living across the country from each other, like Pennsylvania, California. And there is part of me that has learned to respect, man, Karen's upbringing was probably a bit rough then. Because I know I was treated like I had some infectious disease as a kid of divorce in Texas in the 90s. I can't even imagine what it was like then, being a kid of divorce, like in the 70s, well before it was cool. You know what I mean? So, but, and that doesn't mean that it's okay that she allowed things to happen. It also doesn't forgive her necessarily of denying a healing conversation with me. But I can at least acknowledge that I was raised by a person who was probably never aware to unpack and reparent things that they missed or patterns that they learned through their own parents' divorce. Right? So,
Which,
yeah, because go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, which gave you more solid information to make the choice that you did with your
Right.
particular parents.
It
Again,
gives me more context. Yeah.
you weren't like they're bad, bye bye. You gave them chances. You took that time to think about their situation and what led them to their places in life and everything like that. You were quite fair, which is what you should do.
Right.
Even with I would say with an abusive parent. Again, we're not advocating having social contact with people that abuse you in any way, shape, or
Right.
form. We're not
No.
saying that, but you taking that time to think about why somebody did something could help you understand yourself better. More information, the better. That helps.
Yes. And also more information, just compassion too, because it really does go back to like if they were trying their best or not. I think that is an important piece of information to take in as you try to figure out where to heal, right? Because what all are you healing from? But yeah, there's a large body of research around what they're calling adverse childhood experiences. It's shortened to ACEs, that show how early environments impact things like your emotional regulation, your relationships, and even your long term health. So, this is becoming a physical health thing too that starts to get impacted. But we know that already because we've talked about cortisol management and stress impacts. And that actually came up very honestly in the Too Long Didn't Listen on The Illusion of Free, about like how like constantly having stress messages can affect your health and your brain chemistry. But what's really important to drive home here though is that those outcomes are not fixed, right? We can get curious about our own complex outcome and have more drive and more idea of where to heal, because with awareness can come new experiences and those patterns can be updated. But you have to be willing to do something really scary. You have to be willing to do things that aren't familiar so that you can establish new patterns. And so you get to fight that stupid familiarity bias and the simplicity bias, because remember, it's easier to not change things. So you're fighting two things in your own head to try to even begin to effectively reparenting yourself. And that is what reparenting is. So being able to look at this with that lens, I hope can help kickstart you to understanding, first of all, a lot of your little relationship quirks and how you deal with stuff. It's not your fault, but it is still your responsibility. Because even though your story didn't necessarily start with you, like your blueprint, you did not actually get to sit in the drafting meeting for that blueprint. But it doesn't have to stay that way. As you get older, you can now add revisions to that blueprint and therefore put in actionables to change things. But you gotta be aware of it first. So I'm hoping that's what we were able to kind of cover here today, is where our other episode was the cause. Like, yeah, your mom went through these changes. You, as a mom, if you do that route, goes through these changes. Your partner goes through that. This is all now explained. And how that environment is what actually results in who we become as people. That is the environment our parent was working in. So that was cause. This was effect. I think it was a fun conversation to have. I know these are going to be probably a little bit longer because I know we're going into mental health. But I'm watching the time, and I know there was at least one break I had to take for the baby Reverend. So we're not doing bad. We're not doing any more 2-hour episodes, I promise.
Yes, yeah, we'll wait till Fatherhood Month for that. But yeah, and more than anything, too, I guess it's never too late to change people. Even if you're a parent yourself, have some humility, but just do that inner work that needs to be done to make sure to help yourself, but also help your kids too.
Exactly. It helps
Yes.
you. It helps your kids. It can even maybe help your parents too. Like as they've gotten older and maybe developed into different humans themselves. Because if they've worked on plasticity, I don't know, you might actually have a solid shot at talking to them about it. And it would be nice if you can soften yourself where you can too, right? Because I do think we talk a lot about how it's hard to talk to them. But I think we do need to embrace our own biases and our own identities to understand where we can be hard to talk to as well, because of things like hindsight bias and stuff like that, right? Superiority bias that seems to factor on both sides of that equation as we talked through it, right? But we have to know how we can be approachable as the children as well. Because if they want to heal, my gosh, why wouldn't we let them? Like, what level of punishment is enough for them not being perfect and not having all the tools that we have, right? And again, obviously, I am not talking about overtly abusive relationships. I'm so sorry if we were like scratching that record from covering that over and over. I just really want to be abundantly clear on that one. But if it is something that can be worth healing from, totally do that. Almost like the AA. If it's not going to do harm to reach out to you too, you need to have that fair assessment. It's okay to reach out to people to explore repairing conversations. I will also say It's okay if those attempts fall flat on their face, because that is exactly what happened with both of my biological parents. Was I did try to reach out to have a conversation in different ways, they just can't. And having now the ability to kind of accept that there's maybe an element of neuroplasticity there that is not there anymore also does, from my experience, it helps me to recognize that it's okay to start letting go of it. That, yeah, they're around, but in a weird way, they might be effectively dead. But hey, you know what? Maybe they do some puzzles or something and rework some plasticity and want to reach out at some point. Yeah, I'm okay. I would be okay with that, but they got to do it at this point, right? Like I've done my testing field. They need to just let me know at this point. Like, are you open to talking or no? Like that's where we're at. So
Also, too, I think one thing you would agree with is that it is also okay to tell yourself, I need space from this human being, even if that space means you don't talk for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. If you need that space to recover yourself, then take that time away from that person. And if you are the parent that has the adult kid that is no longer talking to you, the most important thing you can do is not try and force any sort of interaction if they do not want it. If you have an adult child that does not want to have an interaction with you, do not try and force something.
Yeah, even if your memory is different, just don't. And that's like really with anybody, I would say. Like there's levels of it worth getting a therapist involved, like, right, like when they're younger kids, I do think you should take more steps to kind of like enforce, like, no, 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 this is how we should fix it. Because again, you're modeling, right? When a relationship goes sour, it's don't just throw it away. It's you work on it. And if you can't work on it directly, you maybe get a mediator or a therapist involved, right? And I've honestly told the Bishop Chris, like at this point, if they don't mention the term therapist, I'm not interested in hearing anything they have to say anymore, because I do believe that's the level that we would need as an adult. But I don't have the ability to make that happen. That's got to be something that they make happen. But yeah, like there's softness required on both sides. So if you are an older generation parent and you happen to be listening to this episode, please understand that a lot of it is we're almost being told that you should have known better. We are. We are being given the message of you should have known better. And there are a lot of biases that make that particularly yummy, right? Because that's what we learned is like pretty much if something's easy to kind of more or less like pitch at somebody, it's probably playing on a bias that wants to eat that food. It wants the simple solution, just cut them off. It wants like you to be right, superiority bias. Like they should have known better. You know what I mean? Like that is so much easier and so much tastier, but it's not going to lead to better healing.
Yeah, you don't want to use mental health jargon to prevent you from growing.
I think I am good. Are there any questions or thoughts that this brought up to you before we wrap it up and say goodbye to our friends for another week?
No, I think we did pretty well this week, all things considering.
Yep. Even a few glitches and a few interruptions from the baby Reverend is he's shifting his sleep schedule and changing my cognitive load yet again. He actually might be done napping, so he's working it out.
Oh boy. Oh man, it's always funny with kids and naps. It's like you want them to take a nap, they don't want to take a nap, and then they get older and they would love to take a nap, and then they don't have the ability to take naps anymore.
No more naps for you. You're done with naps. Need to be done with napping.
Maybe if more high schoolers had the ability to, have nap time, high school would be a little bit better experience.
Also, if we weren't loading them up on stimulants, because I think it is crazy that high schoolers are having coffee. Middle schoolers even now, I guess, like are starting to have coffee drinks. And I'm like, y'all know we have a rise in anxiety, right? Like you do you get what can cause? Okay. Yeah, got it. But overload their schedule, but give them the Starbucks card. Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Or have the Pepsi machine in the school, that's good for their health, right?
Yeah, it's great. I still remember when those first went in, I was like, y'all nuts. Y'all know we're never drinking milk or water again, right? Like it's just, we're gonna go and search the parking lot for quarters so we can have a soda.
Back in Michigan, we had the 10-cent bottle deposit. So, kids are outside collecting bottles to go to the store to get money to, anyway. Anything else for our friends at home?
Nope, just got my stupid mama joke when we're ready to wrap up. I'm ready.
All right. Each week, we have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Yo mama, so psychologically influential, half your dating history was basically a book report on your childhood. Face you make when you don't want to laugh. That's it's the thing our listeners get robbed of every week.
I know. Yeah, but until we get fancier equipment, we're not going video.
No, and also not in a robe and in my I Heart Your Cunt shirt. I got to go change for an interview.
Anyway, au revoir.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.